So what really became of Jimmy Hoffa? Did he meet his end at the hands of a friend? I think after you hear this interview with former prosecutor Charles Brandt, the case will be closed for you. We'll be coming back with the story of I Heard You Paint Houses. That's the title of Charles Brandt's book, and this fascinating tale of the hitman who did the deed. Stay with us. Much more to come. Charles Brandt is a former teacher, welfare investigator, homicide investigator, prosecutor, and chief deputy attorney general for the state of Delaware. Then he went into private practice. He's named as one of the best lawyers in America. But I think despite his lengthy and impressive resume, he might be best known as the guy who solved the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa. Charles Brandt, great to have you on the program.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you. Nice to hear your voice again.
Yours as well. And I heard somebody last week when this story came out about the FBI digging up a field in suburban Detroit, looking once again for the remains of Jimmy Hoffa, and then, of course, folding their tent, not finding anything, based on a tip from this aging mob guy. I thought about you immediately, and I thought to myself, I knew they weren't going to find anything because I knew your story. But I heard a commentator, a political commentator on the air say, who cares about Jimmy Hoffa? And I'm sure there are people who are saying, yeah, I don't care about Jimmy Hoffa. It has no effect on my life. So maybe we start there, Charlie. Why should we care? Well, what is it about that story that makes it such an interesting mystery all these years later for a lot of people? And why is it still important?
Well, that's a good question. I think obviously younger people can't even imagine that it is important to they never heard of Jimmy Hoffa. Let's put it that way, except as the butt of a joke. And so I think as a human being, he's long ago lost to us as a figure that's been missing, and with all kinds of theories about where he is. That gets old. I mean, you start digging up for him, and you dig, and you dig, and you dig, and at some point, even people who care about him say, come on, enough already. You know? And I think there is a kind of tiredness to that story. I'm sorry to have to say that because I wrote a book that deals in large part with what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, but it's definitely a story that as time goes on, people kind of tire of the digs, I think.
Well, if you like stories about the mob, if you like mob history, if you like stories about how Las Vegas grew, how the mob took over basically organized labor for a period of time, I think it is still compelling. And of course, just the fact that it's never been solved is enough to grab me, but it might not grab everybody. However, Hoffa was a major figure in American politics and the organized labor movement. Why don't you begin by telling our listeners how he ranked, why he was so important?
Oh, sure. I think that part of it is absolutely fascinating, and I think people are fascinated by it. The book came out in 2004, and it's never gone out of print. It's constantly selling, and they're going to be making a movie out of it. But I thought I was responding to the question about it as another dig, and now another dig for Hoffa.
Right.
Enough already. Nobody expects you to find Hoffa anymore after all these years. Is I guess the way I should have said it, but. Today, when we think of a labor leader, we immediately think of Jimmy Hoffa. He was by far the most powerful labor leader America's ever had. Whatever the working man or woman of America needed some sense that there was somebody advocating for them, well, that person was Jimmy Hoffa. He was afraid of no one. And he made the American worker feel, I'm on your side. The politicians might not be, and they're my enemy. The corporate America might not be on your side. They're my enemy. I'm Jimmy Hoffa. I'm on your side. And he did an awful lot for the working people. The problem was that at the same time he made alliances to further his goals, and those alliances were with some of the most dangerous people in the country, the organized crime.
And did he need to make that deal, things he accomplished for workers?
He certainly felt that he did. He felt that the corporate America hired thugs and goons to break strikes back in the old labor wars when people would get their heads busted by billy clubs. And that was around the time I was born. That was still going on in 1942, you know. And he felt that he needed to fight fire with fire, and so he formed alliances with the mafia bosses. And what he offered them was a lot of power and a lot of opportunities to make illegal do-re-mi. You know, the title of the book, I Heard You Paint Houses, those are the first words that Jimmy Hoffa ever uttered to Frank the Irishman Sheeran. And to paint a house is to kill somebody. The paint is the blood that spatters on the walls and the floors. And Hoffa, it was 1957. He had just officially taken over as president of the Teamsters. And he had enemies within his own Teamsters organization that he needed to get rid of. So he felt. And he contacted his ally, the mafia boss Russell Buffalino, looking for some muscle. And Russell lent him the big Irishman, 6'4", 220 pounds, and by far the toughest man I ever met. Frank the Irishman Sheeran was not just physically tough, he was mentally tough. And he had been schooled in the art of killing in World War II. He was in 411 combat days. He was in 3 amphibious invasions. 411 combat days is really an outrage. At 200 combat days, they offer you an opportunity to be discharged. The average was 80. He was in the entire war from beginning to end, and he was in General Patton's, quote, killer division, unquote, the Thunderbird Division, 45th Infantry Division. And Patton had counseled that group to be I want the Nazis, the Germans, to be more afraid of you than any other division I have. You're not to take prisoners. You're to be the most ferocious fighting force I have. And they were. The initial atrocities that came out of World War II, the initial arrests, they were all out of the 45th Infantry Division. And their defense, when they would be court-martialed right away in the invasion of Sicily, a captain and a sergeant were court-martialed. They had mowed down a few dozen prisoners each. And they used that defense that Patton had just finished telling us before we came into Sicily from North Africa. He just got finished telling us not to take prisoners. So that was the schooling that Frank had. He was extremely tough. He was a battle-hardened, seasoned veteran of some of the worst fighting the world has ever known.
And then prior to the military, he grew up in a really tough area of Philadelphia, a mostly Italian neighborhood. You say in the book that he basically had to get in a fight every single day.
Yes, he did. George, you're something. Yep, he had to fight his way to and from school, Catholic school. You know, his father was a man who had studied for the priesthood. He spent 5 years in a seminary, and his mother went to Mass every single morning. His father's 2 sisters, Frank's 2 aunts, were teaching nuns at the Catholic schools that Frank went to. He didn't finish school in those days. Not that many people did. You know, my parents, neither of my parents set foot in high school. But you know, the Depression and things being what they were in that part of the world, Frank never really had a chance at an education. But he was a very bright man and a very pleasant guy. He had an almost Huckleberry Finn lifestyle. Although he had to do a lot of fighting, he really didn't do anything wrong until after he got out of the Army.
Well, Huck Finn is an apt example in another way, in that Huck Finn had pap, and Frank Sheeran had a father who liked to put on the gloves and box him around right up until he was a teenager, just beat the hell out of him.
If you could see my smile right now, my goodness, George. Absolutely. His father was an amateur boxer, and his father would toss him the gloves when Frank did something wrong, and Frank was not allowed to hit back. He was allowed to defend himself, and the father would just pepper him with left jabs, left hooks, rights, and he toughened Frank up. Finally, at one point in his life story, Frank ended up hitting the principal of the school, the Catholic school that he was in, breaking the principal's jaw. Frank was 16. His father worked in the Catholic school system, and when he got home, his father tossed the gloves at him, said, "You broke the principal's jaw." And Frank looked at his father and said to him, "You better get yourself another punching bag." He said, "I would never hit you. You're my father. But we're not doing this anymore." And he threw the gloves at his father. And that was the last time his father ever laid a hand on him.
He fought his father. He fought going to and from school with these Italian tough guys in this neighborhood. But it benefited him in other ways because he got to know Italians. He got to learn the language a little bit.
Tell us a bit about Bufalino, because when you think of
organized crime figures, you think of Al Capone or you think of Gotti. A lot of people don't know his name, but he was a really a major guy, maybe the guy.
He really was the guy. The ruling commission that no longer exists, thanks to the Mafia Commission case in 1986. But the ruling commission, the five families of New York City, Buffalo, and Chicago, the heads of those families, made decisions for the rest of the nationwide organized crime families. But they never did anything of any importance without consulting Russell Bufalino, whose acumen, whose intelligence, whose strategizing, whose wisdom was legendary among all of these other bosses in the country. And so before they did anything of any consequence, they consulted Russell, and he either gave his yay or his nay on it, or took it over himself and planned it and took care of it. He was located in northeastern Pennsylvania, in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area. You could go to his drapery store and buy draperies, or you could, as the CIA did, go to him with a plan to kill Fidel Castro. And that's a well-known, admitted by the CIA during the Church Committee hearings of 1975, that the CIA engaged Russell Bufalino and the head of the Chicago Mafia at the time, Sam Giancana, with a plan to kill Castro.
I know that story well because the meetings were held, planning meetings, right here in Las Vegas. Robert Mayhew, an ex-CIA guy who worked for Howard Hughes, helped set it up. Johnny Roselli was sort of the go-between. And we'll come back to that because I want to get into whether or not Frank Sheeran had something to do with or knowledge of the JFK assassination. But for now, let's stick with Bufalino. There's something happened in 1957 that sort of ripped the lid off the whole story about the mafia. I mean, people knew there were mobsters like Al Capone, but they didn't really realize that there was a ruling commission, that these families of different cities worked together until the events of 1957. Tell us that.
Well, in a town in upstate New York called Appalachian, it looks like you want to pronounce it Appalachian, but it's pronounced Appalachian up there, lived a mafia boss named Joe Barbara. And there were some things that were happening in the nationwide mafia that required attention. A renegade wannabe boss named Vito Genovese killed Albert Anastasia killed, a rival boss, and he had the boss of his family shot at, Frank Costello. Costello survived the shooting and then retired. Costello